KO Rider wiped the acid rain from the visor of his helmet and tightened the seal on the terraforming drill. The storm had worsened, its corrosive sheets hissing against his gear. He glanced at the display on his wrist, cursing as the power core's warning light blinked red. Another failure. The machines were as stubborn as Aegis Prime itself, unforgiving and relentless. "This planet hates us," muttered Rin, Kale's crewmate, her voice crackling through the comm link. She was perched on a nearby outcrop, calibrating a wind turbine. "I'm telling you, Kale. We're not meant to be here." Kale smirked faintly but didn't respond. He knew better than to argue. Aegis Prime storms weren't just hostile, they were a constant reminder of humanity's fragile foothold in the galaxy. Still, Kale found a strange pride in the struggle. Surviving here meant something. He stood, scanning the dark horizon. The colony's crystalline walls shimmered faintly in the distance, their lights flickering like fireflies against the storm. A sudden vibration beneath his boots snapped him from his thoughts. The ground trembled, and a deep rumble echoed through the air, like a giant exhaling. "What the hell was that?" Rin asked, her voice sharp. Kale turned toward the sky, his heart quickening. At first, he thought it was lightning, but the flash was too bright, too deliberate. A second later, a jagged shape tore through the clouds. His breath caught as the storm parted, revealing a monstrous alien warship descending like a predator. "Rin, get back to the colony! Now!" "Kale, what?" "Go!" he barked, already running toward the nearest access tunnel. Overhead, smaller ships broke off from the mothership, their sleek forms slicing through the acid rain as they hurtled toward the surface. Explosions bloomed in the distance, fiery blossoms against the storm's darkness. The comlink crackled with panicked voices from the colony. "All personnel, return to the city immediately. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Kale sprinted through the rocky terrain, his lungs burning with every step. The first blast hit before he reached the tunnel, a deafening boom that sent shards of crystal and rock flying. He dove for cover as a shockwave tore through the ground. When he looked up, the tunnel's entrance was gone, buried beneath rubble. "No, no, no!" Kale growled, scrambling to his feet. He activated his comm link. "Rin, report. Did you make it inside?" Static crackled, followed by her voice, tight with fear. "Barely. They're locking the gates." "Kale, where are you?" "Blocked out," he said, scanning for another way in. His mind raced. The colony was a fortress beneath the surface, but the gates wouldn't hold forever against whatever the Dominion had brought. "Kale," another voice interrupted, deep and calm, the overseer, Dren Halvok. "Do not attempt re-entry. Find cover and await instructions." Kale gritted his teeth. "Instructions? Are you kidding me? We're being attacked, Dren." "By who? And why now?" "We don't know yet," Dren replied. "But you won't do anyone any good out there." "Stand by. Stand by," Kale muttered bitterly. He looked to the sky again, watching the massive alien warship descend like a fallen god. Humanity had been at peace for centuries, kept under the supposed protection of the Galactic Concord. But the Concord wouldn't come. Not for Aegis Prime. Another explosion shook the ground, closer this time. Kale turned and ran, searching for shelter. His path took him into a jagged ravine, where the winds howled like a living thing. He ducked beneath an overhang, catching his breath. For a moment there was silence, then a sound, faint but distinct, like a voice echoing in the back of his mind. Asterisk. Kale Rider. Asterisk. He froze, scanning his surroundings. The voice wasn't coming through his comlink, it was inside his head. Asterisk. Do not be afraid. Asterisk. Who's there? Kale whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the plasma cutter at his hip. The air around him seemed to hum, a strange energy prickling his skin. The ground beneath him shifted, and Kale stumbled back as the overhang collapsed, revealing a hidden chamber. The space was vast, its walls lined with ancient machinery that glowed faintly with blue light. At the center stood a massive structure, a ship, sleek and angular, half buried in crystalline rock. Kale, what's going on out there? Rin's voice crackled through the comlink. We're picking up seismic activity near your location. I found something, Kale said, his voice unsteady. He stepped closer to the ship, drawn by an invisible pull. Symbols he didn't recognize glowed along its hull, and a soft hum filled the air, like the ship was alive. As he reached out to touch the surface, the voice returned, clearer this time. Asterisk. You have been chosen. Asterisk. Kale jerked his hand back. Chosen for what? A section of the hull shifted, revealing a sleek interface. A holographic figure materialized, a humanoid shape, its features indistinct but commanding. I am Vanguard, the tactical AI of the warship Ares Ascendant. State your designation. Kale stared, his pulse racing. I'm Kale Ryder. Engineer. What is this place? This vessel, the AI said, is humanity's last line of defense. A relic of Earth's final war. It has remained dormant, awaiting an operator. Wait, Earth's war? That was. Kale paused, shaking his head. This thing's been here for centuries? Affirmative. And now, the time has come to awaken. Before Kale could respond, a distant explosion rattled the chamber. The ground above them quaked as more Dominion forces landed. I can't, Kale said, stepping back. I'm not a soldier. I can't fly this thing. Your hesitation is irrelevant, Vanguard replied. Survival demands action. The Dominion will not stop. You must fight. Kale clenched his fists. The AI's cold certainty was infuriating, but it wasn't wrong. Outside, his people were dying. Waiting for the Concorde's help was a fantasy. He didn't trust himself, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. How does it work? He asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. Synchronize with me, Vanguard said. And together, we will bring wrath to your enemies. Kale took a deep breath and placed his hand on the interface. The chamber filled with light as the Ares Ascendant roared to life, shaking the very ground. Above, the storm raged on, but Kale felt something stir deep within him, an ancient instinct, long buried but not forgotten. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel small. Kale Ryder sat motionless in the cockpit of the Ares Ascendant, his fingers hovering just above the glowing controls. The sleek, polished surfaces hummed with latent energy, and the ship's tactical AI, Vanguard, filled the chamber with its calm, unyielding voice. Neural synchronization in progress. Prepare for disorientation. Kale barely had time to brace himself before a wave of heat surged through his skull, as though molten fire was pouring into his mind. His vision blurred, and fragmented images erupted behind his eyes, battles fought in the distant past, flashes of starships obliterating fleets, and soldiers marching to the beat of war drums. He gasped, clutching the armrests as his body tensed. Relax, Kale, Vanguard instructed. This system is merely integrating your neural pathways. Resistance will only prolong the process. Easy for you to say, Kale hissed through clenched teeth. You're a machine. He stopped, taking a sharp breath as the intensity began to fade. The fiery chaos in his mind ebbed, leaving behind a strange clarity, like he'd been dropped into icy water. You are now synchronized at 47% efficiency, Vanguard continued. Suboptimal, but sufficient for basic operations. Suboptimal? Kale muttered, running a shaky hand through his sweat-drenched hair. I just got plugged into a war machine older than my entire species' galactic history. Cut me some slack. The cockpit lit up with a three-dimensional hologram of Aegis Prime, showing the city's subterranean tunnels, the advancing Dominion forces, and the position of the Ares Ascendant. Kale's stomach turned as he saw how close the enemy troops were to the colony's central hub. We don't have time for this, Kale said, sitting up straighter. Tell me what I need to do. Engage propulsion systems and activate defensive protocols, Vanguard replied. You must repel the Dominion forces before they breach the colony. Kale exhaled slowly, his hands finding the controls. The ship responded instantly, the cockpit vibrating as its ancient systems roared to life. A low, guttural hum filled the air as the Ares Ascendant lifted from the chamber floor, crystalline debris falling away as it ascended toward the surface. "You're really just going to let me fly this thing?" Kale asked. "No training wheels? No manual?" "Your instincts will suffice," Vanguard said. "The synchronization process has already enhanced your cognitive and motor functions." "Great," Kale muttered. "No pressure, then." The ship burst through the surface in a cascade of rock and light, emerging into the stormy skies. Kale gripped the controls tightly as the Ares Ascendant stabilized, its sleek frame cutting through the acidic winds like a blade. Below, the colony glimmered faintly beneath the translucent barriers of its crystalline dome. Kale's comm link crackled to life. "Kale! Is that you?" Rin's voice was frantic, but there was a note of hope beneath the fear. "It's me," Kale replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I found something, an old warship. I'm in it." "Are you insane?" Rin shot back. "You're an engineer, not a pilot. What are you going to do, throw rocks at them?" Kale couldn't help but laugh, though the sound was more nervous than amused. "Not exactly. Just hold on, okay? I'll buy you some time." Before Rin could respond, an alarm blared through the cockpit. The holographic display zoomed in on the approaching Dominion forces. Dozens of alien war machines crawling over the terrain like mechanized insects, their weapons aimed squarely at the colony's gates. "Hostiles detected," Vanguard announced. "Engaging weapon systems." The ship's controls shifted under Kale's hands, guiding him instinctively. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, the Ares Ascendant surging toward the Dominion troops. The ship's weapons activated with a satisfying hum, and Kale felt a strange thrill as his hands moved almost of their own accord. "Primary cannons online," Vanguard reported. "Targeting solutions optimized. Let's see what this thing can do," Kale muttered, aiming at the nearest enemy walker. He squeezed the trigger, and the ship's cannons erupted with a deafening roar. A streak of plasma lanced through the air, striking the walker dead center. It exploded in a shower of sparks and molten metal, its remains collapsing into the mud. Kale let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Okay. That works. Multiple hostiles inbound," Vanguard warned. "Adjust position to maintain optimal firing angles." Kale banked the ship sharply, dodging a barrage of enemy fire. The Ares Ascendant moved with a grace that belied its size, responding to Kale's commands as though it were an extension of his own body. Another volley of plasma blasts tore through the Dominion forces, scattering them like leaves in a storm. "Kale, you're doing it!" Rin's voice came through the comlink again, this time tinged with awe. "You're actually holding them off." "Don't sound so surprised," Kale replied, grinning despite the tension. His hands moved faster now, more confident, as he weaved through the storm and rained destruction on the invaders. For a moment it felt almost easy. But the illusion didn't last. The holographic display lit up with new warnings as a larger Dominion ship descended from the clouds. Its sleek, black frame bristled with weapons, and its engines roared like a beast's growl. "That's not good," Kale said, his grin fading. "Enemy capital ship detected," Vanguard confirmed. "Recommend evasive maneuvers." The Dominion ship opened fire, its massive cannons unleashing a barrage of plasma bolts. Kale yanked the controls, narrowly avoiding the first salvo. The second came closer, rattling the cockpit and sending alarms blaring. "This thing better have a trick up its sleeve," Kale said, his voice tight. "Activating auxiliary weapon systems," Vanguard replied. "Brace for recoil." The ship's frame shuddered as additional panels opened along its sides, revealing rows of missile launchers. Kale locked onto the capital ship and fired, unleashing a swarm of projectiles that streaked through the stormy sky. The missiles struck their target with precision, detonating in a series of fiery explosions that rocked the Dominion ship. Kale watched as the alien vessel faltered, its engine sputtering. But it wasn't done yet. It retaliated with a focused energy beam that sliced through the air, narrowly missing the Ares Ascendant. "Vanguard, any ideas?" Kale asked, gripping the controls tightly. Deploying EMP burst, the AI replied. This will temporarily disable all nearby electronics, including non-critical systems aboard this vessel. Wait, what does that mean for me? Kale demanded, but it was too late. The ship released a pulse of energy, and the lights in the cockpit flickered. The Dominion ship's weapons went silent, its engines stalling as it plummeted toward the surface. Kale exhaled, his body sagging with relief. That worked. Temporary reprieve only, Vanguard said. Additional enemy reinforcements detected. Kale's jaw tightened. He looked out at the stormy horizon, where more Dominion ships loomed in the distance. This was far from over. The rain continued to lash against the hull of the Ares Ascendant, a relentless cacophony punctuated by distant explosions. Kale Ryder tightened his grip on the controls, his gaze fixed on the wave of Dominion reinforcements streaking toward the colony. The holographic display marked them as red blips, an unrelenting tide closing in. They just keep coming, Kale muttered, sweat dripping down his temple. What's the plan here, Vanguard? We can't take them all head-on. Calculating probability of sustained engagement. Vanguard's voice carried its usual calm precision. Conclusion: insufficient firepower to eliminate all hostiles before colony breach. That's not exactly helpful, Kale snapped, his frustration mounting. A new warning flashed on the display. A squadron of Dominion interceptors had locked onto the Ares Ascendant. Their sleek, angular forms cut through the acidic storm, weapons primed. Kale yanked the controls, sending the ship into a sharp dive. Plasma bolts streaked past, illuminating the cockpit with bursts of green light. He rolled the ship, dodging another volley, but the interceptors were relentless, their formation tightening around him. Defensive options? Kale demanded. Deploying countermeasures, Vanguard replied. The ship's hull shimmered as clusters of microdrones burst forth, weaving through the storm like swarms of angry wasps. The drones converged on the interceptors, detonating on impact and shredding the enemy formation. Kale let out a breath, but his relief was short-lived. The display zoomed out, revealing a massive Dominion carrier descending through the storm. It was an ominous silhouette against the churning clouds, bristling with weaponry. Priority target detected, Vanguard announced. Carrier-class vessel equipped with planetary siege capabilities. Immediate action required. Kale's heart pounded as he stared at the behemoth. If that carrier reached the colony, its weapons would reduce everything, and everyone, he cared about to ash. All right, he said, setting his jaw. Let's take it down. The Ares Ascendant surged forward, its engines roaring as it sliced through the storm. Kale's hands moved instinctively over the controls, the neural synchronization guiding his actions with eerie precision. The ship's main cannons powered up, glowing with an intense blue light. Firing primary weapons, Kale said, his voice steady. He unleashed a salvo of plasma bolts that streaked toward the carrier, slamming into its shields with explosive force. The impact sent ripples of energy coursing across the carrier's surface, but its shields held firm. Carrier shields remain at 72%, Vanguard reported. Then we hit it harder, Kale growled. He activated the ship's missile launchers, targeting weak points along the carrier's hull. The missiles arced through the air, their trails illuminating the storm, before striking with devastating precision. Several turrets on the carrier's surface exploded, but the massive vessel continued its advance. The carrier responded with a barrage of its own, its weapons lighting up the stormy sky. Kale twisted the controls, narrowly avoiding a volley of energy beams that scorched the air around him. The Ares Ascendant shuddered as a glancing hit struck its side, alarms blaring in the cockpit. Structural integrity compromised, Vanguard warned. Recommend evasive maneuvers. Kale gritted his teeth. We can't just dodge forever. Give me something, Vanguard, a weak spot, anything. Analyzing carrier schematics, the AI replied. After a brief pause, it continued. Identified vulnerability. Carrier power core housed in rear section. Direct access requires bypassing shield generators. Kale's eyes narrowed. Then we take out the generators first. The Ares Ascendant accelerated, weaving through the storm as Kale targeted the carrier's shield emitters. He fired another barrage of plasma bolts, the impact sending sparks flying from the emitters' housings. One by one, the emitters faltered, their protective energy fields flickering. "Shields at 45%, Vanguard reported. "Continue assault." Kale pushed the ship harder, his focus razor sharp. The storm raged around him, the acidic rain hissing against the hull, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was the carrier and the lives it threatened to destroy. As the last emitter exploded in a burst of fire and debris, the carrier's shields collapsed, leaving its massive hull exposed. Kale didn't wait for instructions. He targeted the power core and fired, sending a stream of plasma straight into the carrier's vulnerable rear section. The explosion was instant and catastrophic. The carrier's engines erupted in a chain reaction, fire consuming its massive frame. Kale pulled the Ares Ascendant back, shielding his eyes as the Dominion vessel disintegrated, its wreckage raining down onto the barren landscape. "Carrier neutralized," Vanguard announced. "Enemy forces in disarray." Kale leaned back in the cockpit, his chest heaving. He allowed himself a brief moment of relief before the comm link crackled to life. "Kale, you did it!" Rin's voice was jubilant, though still tinged with disbelief. "The Dominion ships are retreating. The colony's safe, for now." "For now," Kale echoed, his voice heavy with exhaustion. He stared at the wreckage below, the fiery remains of the Dominion forces casting an eerie glow against the storm. "But they'll be back. This was just the first wave." Rin's tone shifted. "Then we'll be ready. You've shown us we can fight, Kale. We don't have to run anymore." Kale nodded, though she couldn't see him. He glanced at the Ares Ascendant's controls, the ship's hum a steady reminder of its power and its purpose. "This isn't over," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "But if they want a fight, they'll get one." The storm began to abate, the acidic rains slowing to a drizzle. Kale guided the Ares Ascendant back toward the colony, its lights flickering like distant stars against the dark horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kale felt something stir within him, a spark of hope. Humanity wasn't done fighting. Not yet.